You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun. It could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property under laws they had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 267 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. Joining me on today's show is author Brian Saady. He has written 3 books. There's a book series, the Rackets book series. He also wrote an ebook and was on one of the early episodes of Foreign Policy Focus to discuss that. He is the host of the Rackets podcast, and his website, briansaady.com, BrianSaady, for those of you who want to go and check out all of his work. Has a bunch of great stuff, great news. In the past, Brian's been on the show, I believe, 3 times now to talk about different Central and South American countries. We covered Honduras, Guatemala, the migrant crisis, Mexico and the drug war, and a show on Colombia. And so I think I got a really important one today, a really great topic in Venezuela. So Brian, welcome back to the show. Are you ready to talk about, Venezuela and the communist government?
Absolutely. And thanks for having me back.
All right. Well, I guess, let's start off here by kind of going back to where I think, we could the current saga will begin, and that's with the Chavez revolution and just exactly what happened there. And, maybe give us some of what role did the U.S. play? I guess, if any, I really don't know.
Okay. Well, in order to talk about the Chavez revolution, you probably need to know a little bit more about, I guess, some of the history with Venezuela. And I'm going to be pretty concise, but basically, Venezuela's had a long history on and off of various dictatorships. And many of those dictatorships were very U.S. friendly. One of the factoids that you'll hear is back in the 1950s that Venezuela had one of the best economies in the world. And it was, sort of technically true because you're basing it off GDP, but GDP is not always really the best indicator of an economy. For example, China's probably at some point in the near future going to overtake us in the GDP measure, but you're not going to see a bunch of Americans move into China for that reason. You have to really look at per capita numbers. But so again, there was always a really strong U.S. influence in the country. So there was also, the counter to that, there was a lot of very, anti-American sentiment. And, basically, enter Hugo Chavez, lifelong military officer. And back in 1992, he attempted a coup on the government. It was a failed coup. Quite a few people actually died. A lot of people went to prison, including Hugo Chavez. He went to prison, off memory, I think for a couple years. He was released. And that kind of, really, raised his status, as a revolutionary type of figure. And he was elected president, back in 1998. And again, he was definitely a revolutionary in every sense of the word, and very much a socialist or communist, however you want to label him. But you saw a major transition into big government, where the government started to put price controls on food and all types of currency controls, and to where the government really started to take over industries, and in fact actually nationalizing many major businesses. It nationalized major oil companies and agriculture companies, banking, gold miners, steel companies, telecoms, you name it. And really one of the biggest, most high profile examples, was a contract that Exxon had in the country. So they were essentially kicked out of the country. And Exxon actually went to the World Bank to act as an arbiter. And for a while, they actually won a $1.2 billion settlement that's since been overturned. But it just kind of gives you an indicator of just the scale of what the Hugo Chavez government was doing. And again, I know you've got a very sort of libertarian audience, And I think it kind of brings up sort of a libertarian question as to what is the proper policy in a situation like this. And personally, I believe that, the Venezuelan government, they have the right to make these decisions to go in there and nationalize these companies, but they also have to accept the repercussions, because you can guess the obvious repercussions is, well, no foreign company, no major foreign company is going to want to invest in your country. So you see a major capital flight, and it had, really negative economic, consequences from a lot of these actions. Essentially the country basically, it's like one of the worst countries in the world now as far as property rights. But again, I personally feel that they do have their right. He was a democratically elected leader. Some people will disagree with me on that end. But he was, again, a very polarizing figure and really rode a lot of that sort of anti-American sentiment into popularity. So when I say he's polarizing, the poor, again, to overgeneralize, loved him, and the middle class and the upper class generally hated him. In fact, many of them started to emigrate out of the country. But the poor in many ways liked him because a lot of that money did go to different programs to help the poor. So for quite a while, he was really sort of this cult of personality type of figure. And in many ways, it was manufactured because a lot of those tax dollars went to sort of state propaganda. It's also now a country that has, some of the worst press freedom in the world, by numerous different measures. Not absolute censorship, but some real extreme forms of censorship. Some journalists went to prison. Some were charged with, in a pretty famous case, a group of journalists were charged with defamation by the government. So they actually fled because they just didn't believe that they could get a fair trial, in that country. And there's also sort of like covert propaganda, in the favor of the government. And what I mean by that, there's a pretty good example. There was a news organization called, Últimas Noticias. And at one point that was an independent organization, and all of a sudden it was acquired by the shell company. Nobody really knew exactly who acquired the company. And all of a sudden it was basically spitting out pro-government agenda. And long story short, a group of investigative journalists have made a pretty strong case that the company was purchased basically by a proxy for the vice president of the country. So again, the country made a major shift towards socialism or communism, however you want to label it. And again, this was all funded basically because Venezuela has, as far as we know, the most oil reserves in the world. And not only that oil money, also served as basically an olive branch to other sort of socialist or communist countries such as Cuba and Nicaragua, really in particular. They've given their country, major subsidies for oil. So you've got that sort of dynamic going on, and you've got the U.S. in the background, and there's been a bunch of corruption and all types of different issues, with that. So the U.S. government has, slapped Venezuela, different officials and companies with all types of sanctions. And I came across a study, a pretty recent one, where the estimate was that these sanctions have cost the Venezuelan economy roughly $6 billion over the last year. And in a country that currently is really struggling economically, that's pretty darn bad. So a lot of the supporters of Chavez, or not really Chavez anymore, the Venezuelan government will sort of point to that as the reason behind all of the suffering in Venezuela. And I strongly disagree with it. I think it's a factor, but I don't think it's the strongest factor. And I'll get into that a little bit later when we start to talk about corruption and all of these different issues. But basically, in the latter part of the last decade, that's when oil prices started to drop. That's when the problems really started to become much more visible in Venezuela. And again, to be pretty succinct, Chavez passed away in 2013. The current leader, Nicolas Maduro, he's now the president. He was the vice president at the time. Chavez was a very sort of charismatic guy, and he knew how to use media, and he had a real, again, a sort of a charisma, you could say, and he knew how to win over crowds. Maduro, on the other hand, he's really just sort of the opposite. And he's just walked into a bad situation that's just only getting worse. So currently they're suffering from record inflation. You've got all kinds of food shortages, record level crimes. Some people would actually put their murder rate as one of the highest in the world. And people are fleeing the country in really high numbers. I saw a figure where roughly over 2 million people have fled the country, and I think it's over the last year. So that's a lot of people. And you have to look at it in this context. It's a country of roughly about 30 million people. So, and you can see sort of these sensational stories in the news where people are eating trash there. And certainly that's the case, in some cases. But, basically I guess to sum it up, the Chavez revolution, it seemed to have a pretty good run there in the beginning when oil prices were high, and he could implement a lot of those social programs for the poor. But the government basically took over not all of industry, but most of industry, and to sort of plan the economy. And it's just really fallen apart, and it's just led to rampant corruption. And, the people in power are not suffering in any way, but in a really poor country, it's just a really bad situation there right now. Is probably how I would sum it up.
All right. Well, thank you for that summary. It was great. I would, I guess, just take a minute to add that, you talk about a little bit the libertarian position here. Certainly, I don't think the U.S. government should be doing anything at all about, the situation. Not exactly in favor of, a government being able to seize the private property of a company. But at the same time, my guess is that the, contract that the government had with Exxon had plenty of goodies, baked into it for both of the, Exxon, oil elites and, the Venezuelan government at the time, whatever it was. And so, it's not like people were necessarily playing fair to begin with here. And
no, you really hit the nail on the head. I mean, now I don't know about the current ones, but when you go back decades ago, you're really talking about the quintessential sort of puppet dictators where they literally allowed the oil companies to sort of write the laws for everything that had to do with drilling and all that type of thing. So yeah, I mean, you can understand the anti-American sentiment. Again, I guess I don't know how to say it. You can understand how when a Chavez or Maduro, when they play upon this sort of anti-American propaganda, there is some element of truth to that this big superpower has sort of been exploiting this smaller country for a long time.
Yeah. Can I just ask then, do you have any idea, I guess, during this time, why the U.S. would kind of end up with Venezuela as an enemy? It seems like, this doesn't happen until the 1990s. The Soviet Union's already gone and dissolved. So, the communism position shouldn't have been a big deal. Kind of shrug your shoulders and say, well, if they want to bankrupt themselves, then, that's really none of our business, but we'll buy their oil. It's pretty close to us and everything. And it seems a hell of a lot easier to get oil from Venezuela than to, have to deal with Iraqi and Kuwaiti politics. So,
I think it's really pure greed. In many ways, I point out that I really don't feel that the Cold War has truly ended. Now, we're not fighting it on the battlefield, but we fight it really in sort of economic and really military terms in a way. And you've heard me talk about it before. A lot of times, really, the drug war serves in this way. For example, like a Honduras, for example, that has a horrible counter-narcotics strategy, but they have a really right-wing leader in place who falls in line with our economic and our military ideology. There's a lot of other factors, and a lot of it just basically has, in my opinion, has to do with the influence that corporate lobbyists have. And Exxon has a lot of power. Those lobbyists to influence policy. You also have the military industrial complex obviously has a lot of influence on foreign policy. And even though, yes, Venezuela isn't a true military threat to our country, but we're always building up and preparing for that. And we'll use a lot of that rhetoric when really a lot of it, in my opinion, comes down to we're really just trying to protect our American corporate interests in these other countries. It's really essentially empire building, in another form.
Yeah, I mean, I guess as, absolutely stupid as that is, it's the only thing that really made sense, right? That
yeah, and I don't agree with it in any way. Yeah, exactly. But that really, in my opinion, is the unofficial U.S. foreign policy, particularly in Central and South America.
All right. To get back a little bit, we're looking at the communist revolution and everything. So has there always been an opposition to the Chavez or Maduro government, or is it something that's relatively new? And I guess just kind of generally, what has that looked like?
Well, back in 2002, there was a coup attempt that actually took Chavez out of power for roughly 48 hours. And the U.S. definitely had fingerprints all over this coup. The actual coup was a military coup, and most of the leaders of that military coup were graduates of the School of Americas. And I imagine a lot of your audience is familiar with that. But for people who aren't, essentially that's a program. It's a military program, back in Georgia. We've changed names because there's just been so much negative press associated with it. But the informal name for the School of Americas in Latin America, it's known as the School of the Coup, because essentially if you look at almost every coup that's taken place in Central or South America, time and time again, these were people who were trained on U.S. soil. They were trained in techniques of torture. You look at so many of these different human rights abuses that have taken place by different paramilitary or military groups in Latin America, and time again, they were trained on U.S. soil. So this was another one of those examples. And also some of the people who were coordinating this coup, they were also received money from the National Endowment for Democracy, or NED, which again, I assume a lot of your audience is familiar with that, but to give a really simple explanation, it's essentially a U.S. tax-funded group that's deeply connected with the CIA. And again, if you look at many of these different coups from around the world, and it's not just Latin America, often the National Endowment for Democracy is connected. And the actual coup leaders went to again, this was 2002, so George W. Bush was in the White House. High-level Bush officials met with the leaders of the coup not long before it took place. And, various investigative journals have looked into it, through Freedom of Information Act requests. And at a minimum, the U.S. government knew that it would take place. Now, I don't know of any sort of evidence of how much support that we gave, but usually in these cases, we don't even really necessarily need to support it. It's just essentially giving them the thumbs up that if you're able to accomplish your goal, we're not going to resist it. So just to kind of give you, I guess a little refresher. So that coup took place again in 2002, and Chavez was overtaken for roughly 48 hours. So again, it was briefly successful. And in the interim period, there was a guy named Pedro Carmona. He's basically an very high-level oil businessman. He was named the interim president of Venezuela. So whereas most of the world looked on at this in shock, as opposed the U.S. government immediately recognized him, gave him formal recognition as the leader of Venezuela. And again, that really sort of gives you a pretty good indicator that yes, for a long time, the U.S. government has had its eyes on overthrowing this country. Again, for quite a long time.
Yeah. And, just to emphasize that international recognition from the United States is very important. Being a UN Permanent Security Council member, so having the veto power to, make sure no UN Security Council resolutions go towards overthrowing you or, delegitimizing you. The U.S. is the world reserve currency. So in both of these ways, kind of if you don't have the U.S. recognition, it's probably pretty hard to establish anything. Kind of look at the situation for the Houthis in Yemen, who now that, the central bank has been moved, they can't get loans for foods up there at all.
Yeah, exactly.
I want to talk about the current opposition. Thinking, the past couple of years, I know there's been some, different votes in elections and things like that. I was wondering, Brian, if you could just kind of generally, let us know, like, what the opposition is like. How many are there? If you look at, I think, polling from more American sources, it looks like it's about half the country, supports the opposition over Maduro.
Yeah, it's really tough to say exactly what number that is. I can probably more point to, I guess, general leaders, who are the opposition. So, but I think it's important to know this. So for example, there's a guy, Enrique Capriles. He was a former governor in the country, and essentially he is now banned from running for president in that country. He's one of many people. These are, again, opposition leaders. But I guess I would say in general, the opposition's kind of fragmented because you don't really have a true leader. There's another guy, Leopoldo Lopez. He's another person who's banned. He was jailed for a while. The charges were basically inciting a riot. Who knows how accurate those charges are? Most, outside independent people view them as really or him in particular as a political prisoner. But yeah, it's tough to say that, there's been a lot of attempts to sort of disrupt and to take him out of power. You may have heard about, there was a drone attack recently, in Venezuela there. The Venezuelan government accuses a guy from Miami. He's a Miami resident, the son of a very wealthy Venezuelan businessman, is the sort of orchestrator of the coup. And then it sort of gets really ridiculous. Maduro claims that Juan Manuel Santos, he's the former president of Colombia, organized that attack. I won't even waste time going into all the reasons why I think that's just absolutely insane and illogical. There's smaller groups as well. You may have heard about this sort of helicopter attack that was against the Venezuelan Supreme Court there, where a guy literally stole a military helicopter and threw grenades at it. But again, he was part of one of these opposition groups. So, but to sort of suffice it to say, it's very fragmented, but I would definitely say that the majority of Venezuelans do not approve of Maduro and his regime, for sure.
All right. I guess, we talked a little bit about like how much power, the group has, like being able to carry out a couple assassination attempts. But I mean, do they have any ability to change Maduro policy or, I don't know, like, are they able in any way to kind of curb what Maduro could do? Or are they pretty much just, at the mercy of the government?
It's a really sad situation because I don't really know what the answer is. And I'll say it this way. I'm going to answer you indirectly. So a lot of people sort of labeled Chavez as a dictator. I don't know what the appropriate term was, but I think that was too strong of a label. Now, yes, like I said, he used state government media to sort of verbally attack his opponents. He banned certain people from running for election, even though, again, this was a guy who tried to have a revolution himself, who then won in a democratic election. But at the end of the day, his elections, the actual elections, I think were free and fair. Now, there's also some controversy to that, but I think that you could label those as free and fair elections, but the buildup and the actual circumstances around it definitely weren't. But the real turning point with the new Maduro government, in my opinion, to where you can start to throw those labels of an autocrat or a dictator, that was last year. And there was this assembly election. And I think it's practically, in my opinion, impossible to believe that there wasn't rampant voter fraud. And in fact, the actual company that made the voting machines publicly went out and said that this was voter fraud. So let me just give you a little details about it. So the Maduro government at the end of the day said that there were 8 million votes, but by all public figures, an hour up to the closing of the election, there were 3.7 million votes. So it's possible that, 4.3 million people voted in that last hour, but it's just every person who knows anything about elections tells you that no, this was absolute fraud. And to me, in my eyes, that's the final step to where you've now stepped into that autocrat or dictator, whatever term you want to use. And I'll give you a better example. And I can't think of the organization right now, but they labeled Maduro as their organized crime figure of the world for 2016. And basically you can definitely label this as basically kind of like a gangster government. We talked about the $6 billion in damages from the U.S. sanctions, which is definitely damaging to a struggling economy. But there are estimates that $70 billion with a B has been embezzled from the Venezuelan government. And it's all of these different cronies. And again, in a country where there are people literally eating out of trash cans, that $70 billion has been stolen from the government. Maduro himself has reportedly demanded a $50 million bribe in a scandal called the Odebrecht scandal. It's this Brazilian company that's literally paid out over $1 billion in bribes to heads of state all throughout Latin America. It's essentially the largest corruption scandal in the world.
This is a construction company, right?
Yes.
Oh, man, I'd love to talk about you and do a show on this sometime because I've read like part of this story and I'll let you go on in a second, but it's absolutely insane.
And there's just layers and layers to that. Oh, my goodness. Yeah. Operation Car Wash. People can just kind of do a quick Google check on that and just read a little bit about it. It'll blow your mind. And yes, he's been named in that. There's just all kinds of scandals attached to his government. There's literally even a scandal in which, because again, I was telling you, the government has control over the food supply. Since most of the food has to be imported in, since they nationalized so many of these different companies, well, there's different scandals in which different members of the military are trafficking. There's a black market food market in Venezuela. And a lot of times it's actual members of the military who are profiting off of this. And again, the crime is super high. And one of the most controversial things that doesn't really get mentioned in a lot of international media is there was this decision to establish what they call peace zones in really some of the most violent parts of the country. And what that is, it's basically where the gangs have like a de facto leadership over certain areas. The police are literally not allowed to enter into certain parts without a warrant or without permission from those gang leaders. So they've essentially been given total reign. And so guess what happens? It's extortion, it's violence. They're the ones running the show. Some of your listeners, they might have heard about these colectivos. They see these images of these motorcycle gangs with the red bandanas. And essentially they're basically, again, these are essentially government sponsored gangsters. Whenever there's some sort of opposition rally, these gangsters go out there and they bust it up. Some of them have actually gone on the record and said that they're paid directly by the government. What's more likely for most of them essentially is they're just sort of given free rein. You can deal drugs, you can extort people, you can rob people. The government will look the other way as long as you're smashing down anti-government suppression. There's also a group called the OLP, which is supposed to be the government's, I guess you could call it their anti-gang unit, for the lack of a better term. Some people in the international press have labeled them a death squad. So this group, they're responsible. They've literally killed over 500 different people in these different, anti-crime raids. Some journalists have pointed out that not all of these people, some of them really are actual gangsters. But they're, again, not the gangsters who are in the pocket of the government. But in many cases, a lot of these people are, again, anti-government, sort of activists. So it's really just sort of a way to really enforce, their, just to sort of keep them in power. But really one of the biggest and the worst aspects of all this corruption is there's a term, in Venezuela called the cartel of the sons. And basically, long story short, it's very well known that many of the top military officials are the biggest drug traffickers in the country. Anybody who's familiar with the group Insight Crime, the reason why I point to them, because especially with Venezuela, there's so much partisanship with the analysis. That is as nonpartisan as it gets. And I've got it written down. I kept my notes here. They estimate that there are 123 high-level government officials in Venezuela that are deeply tied to crime. And that's definitely also pointing to this sort of group, the Cartel of the Suns. They have deep links with the FARC. So you have to understand, their neighbor is Colombia, which is now the biggest, producer of cocaine in the world. And then with Venezuela's proximity, it's essentially the courier to the east coast of the United States, but more importantly to Europe and, Africa and all of those routes. But yeah, I mean, there's just so much corruption to point to. It's kind of funny, and it's something I've noticed. I haven't really noticed somebody else point out, but there's been so many of these Venezuelan officials who've been indicted or sanctioned that it's actually unofficially kind of a badge of honor in Venezuela. I've noticed that Maduro has actually promoted generals immediately after being indicted on drug charges. And here's some of the kind of the inside baseball. There was I'll have to forward it to you, a really good story in McClatchy where they were talking with these different U.S. officials to where the U.S. government's essentially almost kind of playing games to create, I guess, sort of tension within the Maduro government. There are so many of these officials that they can sanction or indict, but they'll purposely withhold for some of them because that way they don't want Maduro to know exactly who's a plant, who's actually talking to them and who isn't, just to sort of keep them guessing. So when somebody actually does get indicted, then you're now sort of a trusted source. I mean, there's so much to talk about here, particularly on this topic. I would, when we talked about just stuff that the listeners can Google, I would tell them to look into a name, Walid Makhled. He was the top drug trafficker in the country. And it was just sort of very well known that there's so many signs pointing to high level corruption. He had this, again, one of the few businesses that wasn't privatized. He had a major airline. He also had an agriculture company. They got a bunch of these sweetheart contracts, and that company was also, the agriculture company is of importance because it produced the chemical that is a precursor for making cocaine. Long story short, he's now in prison. And that's really just sort of one of those sort of geopolitical battles where, cause he was actually busted in Colombia and the U.S. wanted him bad. But the guy I mentioned earlier, Juan Manuel Santos, actually handed him over to Venezuela. We have no idea the kind of information that he could have passed on, but yeah, he's currently sitting in prison in Venezuela. But again, this stuff, it all goes up to the top. Maduro's wife's nephews are currently in prison in the U.S. on major drug trafficking charges. And of course, Maduro sort of labeled it as fake news or an attack, and in many cases we have used, drug cases to sort of drum up, sort of an act of aggression that really weren't really truly, fair cases. But in this case, it was. I mean, there's literally text messages where his nephews sent pictures with bodies with severed heads and talking about different hits. Again, this is a government that is deeply corrupt, that has all types of ties to all kinds of just very high level crimes. And again, it's in a country where there's just so many people who are starving and leaving the country in high numbers. And this inner circle is just making a fortune. The vice president, again, I don't know how accurate it is when you're taking these numbers from the U.S. government. Take it with a certain grain of you should have a certain sense of skepticism. But according to the U.S. numbers, the vice president there has an estimated worth of $3 billion, and they've used that to sanction and confiscate all types of different properties here in the U.S. and different businesses. But they make the link that he's not only attached to drug trafficking, but also to Hezbollah and using a lot of that money to fund them as well. But yeah, just, I guess to sort of wrap it all up again, the Maduro regime, I don't know how this ends. But as of now, he's got a strong inner circle that's making a ton of money. And It's, and I don't really know how this ends.
All right. I did want to just ask, do you have, and I know this is probably a hard question to answer just as like with the fragmentation of the rebel groups, but, do you feel like, they're like kind of democratic, liberal reformers, or are we looking at, more of a Syria situation where Assad's in control and then the opposition is, a bunch of nut jobs as well?
We move back, then the immediate shift to the exact opposite extreme where you put sort of a fascist leader like the Brazilian Bolsonaro in charge. That's what you're asking?
Yeah.
I really don't know because again, it is so fragmented. And I haven't really dived in to really look at so much of the politics of these different leaders because again, it's so hard to really get the real truth of the matter. And I just I've kind of, in my opinion, it's just sort of a wait and see. If somebody actually does come in place, it's pretty interesting because again, we talk about, U.S. policy. There was a story pretty darn recently in the New York Times, and it said that there were these actual members who are sanctioned, these high level military figures, again, who have U.S. sanctions, which according to my understanding, they're not even supposed to be allowed to enter the United States when you are sanctioned, but they entered the United States and they met with very high-level members of the Trump administration, and they discussed a military coup. It's something Trump's pretty openly talked about. It's something back when Rex Tillerson was the Secretary of State, he sort of openly talked about. And again, that guy's a former Exxon executive, so there's a little bit of a conflict of interest there. But the U.S. government, according to all of the available information, didn't provide them any assistance, and didn't go forward with any of the plans. But just the fact that you have these officials who are already under sanctions, that now you're willing to talk to them as long as they're talking about a plan to overthrow the government. So it's, it's a mess all around in so many aspects.
Yeah, I mean, the Trump policy on Venezuela, it's one of those things that makes no sense to me whatsoever. If Trump really wants to turn up the screws on Iran and, try to, put pressure on the Ayatollah, it seems like the smartest thing he could do is just open up a bunch of U.S. oil investment into Venezuela and let, a bunch of capital pour in and them start producing all the oil. And then people could all, go buy that rather than trying to, keep the Chinese and the Indians from buying, Iranian oil when they're a massive population that needs energy. And, I was just wondering if you had any idea on why the Trump administration seems, a little bit more hawkish than, the U.S. in the past, at least, going back to the days of, George Bush and being called the Great Satan.
I think that, and I don't know. For one thing, funny if we were just talking about any sort of Trump policy. Over the week, I was reading Bob Woodward's Fear, which kind of confirmed a lot of my suspicions that essentially he doesn't really have much strategy at all. It was definitely not a flattering book. But I think it's just what you said there. Well, we can pump a bunch of money into Venezuela here. I think a lot of it just comes down to, I guess, a grandiose and a sort of a greed factor that you just want to dominate everything. And a lot of times that's really been U.S. foreign policy. But no, I don't really know. I don't have any of the inside baseball as far as, what his strategy is, but it seems to just be more of the same. He's just a little bit more direct and honest, about, past administrations. If the same opportunity would have come across, I have no doubt that they wouldn't have had the same discussions as well.
Yeah. One, I guess, kind of positive thing is Nikki Haley seemed to be a particularly hawkish Trump administration official on this, and she's going to be stepping down here in a month or so. So, not that I think that the new U.S. ambassador for the UN is going to be any kind of anti-interventionist, but maybe it'll go back to having one that doesn't even know where Venezuela is on the map and is, just kind of focused on, the Middle East and Asia. And at least then we could ease, some of the hostilities, and seems like ramping up of tensions under the Trump administration. I mean, there certainly have been those kind of, not direct, but, suggestions of a coup or an overthrow of the government, or, I think at one point they were even, I know there was reports, and I guess it's hard to substantiate, especially in the, Trump era and the media just reporting any old anonymous sources saying exactly what came out of Trump's mouth. But Trump's advisors were talking him out of trying to invade Venezuela.
Oh yeah. I mean, during his UN speech, he kept speaking a little bit more in code. He kept using the term democracy. We have to restore democracy in Venezuela, which again, I've already sort of covered that, but we have these exact same issues in other Latin American countries, and he's got nothing but praise for them because they're allies. So yeah, I mean, he's been pretty direct about it. And that's the difference between Trump and the predecessors, is that, the predecessors had more common sense to just not be public about that. They did all this kind of stuff behind closed doors, and it didn't leak quite as extensively.
Right. I mean, democracy means nothing. Look at the U.S. Middle East policy with, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the ruling family in the Emirates, the military, leader al-Sisi there arresting all of his opponents in Egypt. It has nothing to do at all with democracy. So that's pretty much the one thing you could definitely rule out about the American empire's motivations. It has nothing to do with democracy or American values.
Absolutely. You'll hear the same term used interchange, human rights, or like I said, I point out a lot of the stuff with the counter narcotics. We got to fight this drug war. And again, that's used very selectively as well. So yes, absolutely.
All right, Brian, do you have anything else to add here? I think I had about everything in our notes covered now.
Nothing off the top of my head, no.
All right, well, thanks. This was absolutely great. I can't wait to listen to it again. Everybody in the audience, this has been Brian Saady, author of a 3-book series, Rackets, and then an ebook on the drug war in Mexico. We did a show on that. That'll be linked to in the show notes page. At his website, you can find the Rackets podcast. There's been a bunch of great guests on that show. So check all that out. Brian, do you have anywhere else you want to send people? I don't know if you have a Patreon or Twitter.
I have a Twitter. I use social media selectively. All my handles will be under my name. But yeah, you can go check out my website if you're interested more in my work. If this interested you, I'm pretty sure you'll like some of my other work as well. Check me out on social media at Brian Saady, and my website, again, briansaady.com.
All right, thanks. This has been great. We'll have to do it again.
Absolutely. I look forward to it.